What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. I want to talk to you about a graphic novel that I recently finished reading, Essential Daredevil Volume 6. This is the last of the Essential books, and this collects quite a few issues in it. Daredevil 126 through 146, Annual 4, Iron Man 88 through 89, and Ghost Rider 20. And this is written and drawn by several people. Most of this is by Marv Wolfman. You've also got some credits by Bill Mantlo, Jim Shooter, Chris Claremont, Archie Goodwin, and then the art is by Bob Brown, John Buscema. John Byrne has some art credit here. I think in the annual he did like the roughs on it. Sal Buscema, Gil Kane, and George Tuska. But like I said, Marv Wolfman wrote most of this. There's a couple of issues that Marv Wolfman plotted and someone else scripted. The annual, Marv Wolfman plotted it, but Chris Claremont did the actual dialogue, and then that's the same thing on one of the issues. Wolfman plotted and Jim Shooter scripted, and then Jerry Conway, he plotted a couple of issues with Jim Shooter scripting, and then right at the very end of this book, you get Jim Shooter flying solo. So I don't know if Jim Shooter had a run on Daredevil or not. I'm not sure if that was a thing or if it was just like a 1 or 2 issue thing and then somebody else came in after Jim Shooter. So there are quite a few things that I really like about this book. And I've been pretty hard on Daredevil when I've been reviewing these Essential books because a lot of the stuff from the 1960s just was not very good. It took a really long time for this series to really find its feet. And I want to go so far as to say that the stuff by Marv Wolfman is very underrated. A lot of people like to give Frank Miller credit for really taking Daredevil and transforming him from a character that nobody cared about and really putting his name on the map. Not only putting Daredevil's name on the map, but also putting his own name on the map. That was really when people started to find out about Frank Miller. I want to say that while that's probably justly so, I haven't read any of Frank Miller's Daredevil work yet. I will get to that someday soon. But I want to say that Wolfman probably deserves a little bit of the credit there too, because there's a couple of things here that Wolfman does that I really think turns this series around from a series that was really hard for me to get into to a series that I was starting to enjoy reading. Number one, he gives Daredevil a brand new girlfriend, and although the way that girlfriend is introduced is very weird and contrived, I really like this character. Her name is Heather Glen, I think is her name, and she just waltzes into Daredevil's apartment one day and she's like, "Oh, you're not my former ex-boyfriend who I'm no longer dating," and I just walked into his apartment for no real reason at all. It's really weird. She acts like she just randomly walks into her ex-boyfriend's apartment and then she says, "Well, I didn't really like my ex-boyfriend. He was kind of a jerk, but I wanted to come in here and kind of patch things up with him anyway, and then I find this cutie in here." And like 0.5 seconds after she meets Matt, she's like flirting with him and kissing him on the cheek and saying, "Well, I'll see you later," and then she leaves, and then she comes back and says, "Hey, good news, my ex-boyfriend is married now, so I don't have to worry about him anymore, so now you and I are dating." And that's about how it happens. It's very rushed. It's very weird how she's introduced into Matt's life. Having said that, I like this character more than any of Matt's other relationships that he's had so far. And to be fair, that's only been 2 women. That's been Karen Page and the Black Widow. With Karen Page, she was very much a respectable, no-nonsense kind of girl, but she was very hard for me to like because, especially in the early days, she didn't really seem to actually like Matt Murdock. She only wanted to get with him to be like a mother hen to him. It was a very creepy kind of romance that she had with him, and she would often go on about how he was being so selfish because he didn't want to have the surgery to restore his sight that could possibly restore his sight and stuff like that. And she was like, "Well, I could never get with him because he's blind," and just, she was not a very likable character. And then finally, this series got rid of Karen Page, and then you had the Black Widow, who was an entirely different unlikable character because she was always going on about how Matt Murdock was always trying to step on her, and she's a modern, confident, independent woman, and he's trying to hold her back, even though that wasn't really the case. Admittedly, Matt did have some problems adjusting to dating a modern, confident, independent woman, but he wasn't trying to hold her back. And like I said before, I never actually got the feeling that Matt and Natasha actually liked each other that much, so that was a really weird relationship there. Here we have a couple who they actually seem to like each other. Matt really likes Heather. Once we get past the really weirdness of these two meeting each other, they actually seem to like each other. She's willing to give him space, although she knows that stuff is going on that he's not telling her. She's not crowding him trying to say, "Hey, what were you doing this afternoon when you were disappeared for like 4 hours?" And he's off being Daredevil, but she's not pushing him too hard. She wants to know what's going on, but she's not going to keep asking him about it. I really like this character. And also, she is kind of the gateway to another aspect of this book that I really like. She is the one who suggests to Matt that he start up basically a low-level kind of a law firm for poor people and people who are needing some legal advice quickly. She kind of is the one who suggests that he does that, and he starts up this new law firm with Foggy Nelson. Last we saw Foggy, he was the district attorney, and he is during a re-election campaign. Long story short, he is not re-elected as district attorney, and so he and Matt start up this business together, and it resembles the Nelson and Murdoch that I've seen outside of comics a whole lot, like from the Netflix TV show and from the movie, where it's a law firm, but it's really a small law firm that's more for people who can't afford really famous, really expensive lawyers. It's more like that, which before, there was Nelson and Murdoch almost immediately after the series got started, but it really wasn't anything like what you've seen in the movie or in the TV show, because by like issue 3, you've got the Fantastic Four literally knocking down Nelson and Murdoch's door so that they can do the taxes for them, and that's not really for the common man, for the guy on the street who has no money and needs a lawyer. And so they set up this new law firm to help the little people, and I really like that. It really makes Daredevil seem a little bit more accessible, and it puts him just a little bit closer to being in the real world of Hell's Kitchen that we get to see right around the time when Frank Miller starts on the book, where he puts Daredevil right in the middle of a very grim and gritty looking world. In fact, I think the words grim and gritty were invented for Frank Miller's Daredevil. So this puts the series Daredevil a little bit closer to that, and I really like that. And while we're talking about that, I really like that we've got Nelson and Murdoch once again actually working together. Admittedly, Foggy doesn't get to do a whole lot in this book. He's mostly just on the side worrying about stuff, and I will talk about what he's worrying about in a minute, because there are a few complaints that I had about this book. But first I want to talk about the other big thing that Wolfman did on Daredevil. He introduces Bullseye. This is a character who is introduced in this run. Up until this point, if you had only read the first 5 essential volumes of Daredevil, you might be thinking, there's really not any good Daredevil villains in this series. The closest thing that you have to a good villain is the Owl, and he shows up for a couple of issues in this book, but he doesn't really get to do anything very threatening or menacing. But the Owl is basically the most important Daredevil villain. After him, you've got the Jester, who is a character these days, I want to say most people don't really know anything about the Jester. I know that he has shown up some in modern comics, but not nearly as much as some of the other Daredevil villains who haven't shown up at all in this series. You've got characters like the Kingpin, Bullseye, Elektra, the Hand. Those characters, none of them are in the series at this point, and all of that is stuff that you can thank Frank Miller for, and he really does do a whole lot to kind of bring a lot of those well-known Daredevil elements into the series. But the one element that Frank Miller did not introduce into the series was Bullseye, and I will say he doesn't seem as dark and twisted as I've often expected Bullseye to be, because I've seen him in a few comics here and there outside of the Daredevil series, like when the Dark Reign stuff was going on a few years ago, where Norman Osborn basically took over S.H.I.E.L.D. and he installed his own Avengers team. He had Bullseye dressed up as Hawkeye, and he was very dark and twisted, very psychotic, like he was doing this just for fun. He doesn't quite strike me as that here. Here he's more, he was in Nam, he was a sniper, a really good sniper. Before he was drafted into the war, he was a baseball player, and now he just does what he does for money. He's a little bit insane. Like there's one fight between him and Daredevil in the last issue of this book where he tries to kill a woman, even though Daredevil did exactly what Bullseye said for him to do, and then he tries to kill this woman anyway. Daredevil winds up saving her life, but he's not entirely an honorable character, but he doesn't strike me as the psychopath that he is portrayed as being later on. He's much more just in it for the money, but there is a dark streak to his character. But those are some of the really big elements that Marv Wolfman introduced into this series, and I want to go ahead and say I feel like Wolfman unjustly kind of gets forgotten when people talk about how fantastic this series is because of Frank Miller. Wolfman did a lot to kind of bring this series closer to where Frank Miller wanted it to be before Frank Miller came on the scene. And I will go ahead and say that by the time Wolfman leaves, or by the time you get to the end of this book, there's still about 20 issues or so before Frank Miller comes on board. So we're not immediately at that point where Frank Miller comes in just yet. But I did think that it was kind of cool, all the different things that Wolfman did for this series. Now I wanted to go ahead and talk about a couple of complaints. The way that Wolfman handles this is there are a lot of jumbled plot lines, lost plot lines, forgotten plot lines and stuff, things that he is introducing and taking care of, stuff that was kind of left hanging from before he came on the book that he's trying to tie up some of that stuff, and then he's also introducing some stuff, and he introduces a lot of plot lines, and for the most part, everything gets tied up. There are a couple of things that don't, and that's kind of where I wanted to address some things. Number one, right before Wolfman came on board, or it might have been, it was at the end of Essential Volume 5, and it might have been just right at the very beginning of Wolfman's run, but we had this guy who was talking about this machine that he had made. And then, meanwhile, right around the same time, you're seeing all these commercials of Foggy Nelson, who is trying to run for re-election for district attorney, and then, like, a pie hits him in the face, or something like that. And then Foggy is furious, saying, okay, who's running these commercials? I didn't film that commercial. Who did that? And that's a huge part of Wolfman's run. It turns out that the Jester is basically trying to humiliate Foggy Nelson and prevent him from running for district attorney because of the previous story that used the Jester, where he's trying to get revenge on Foggy. And I'll be honest, I couldn't even remember what it was that he wanted to get revenge on Foggy for, but he's trying to get revenge on Foggy and keep him from running for district attorney. Meanwhile, he's also running all these commercials that are saying things like, the Kennedy brothers are still alive. John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy are not actually dead. Because bear in mind, these comics were coming out in like 1975. That would be a really strange commercial to air today, but in 1975, if you were to tell someone that the Kennedy brothers were still alive, that would be a little bit more believable then than it would be now. And then you've also got stuff like the Vietnam War didn't actually happen. Basically, the Jester is just trying to create a lot of chaos. He just wants to take over the city and possibly the world, and he wants to do that by making the public not sure what they are supposed to believe. He tells them that Daredevil killed a police officer. Well, then in the newspaper, the chief of police says, hey, we've accounted for all of our police officers. Daredevil didn't kill anybody. Nobody killed any of our police officers. We don't really know what's going on here. And Jester is basically just trying to create this huge scene of mass chaos so that he and his men can freely rob banks and eventually move on to bigger and better things. And that is a huge part of Wolfman's run. There's a lot of build up to it, and then when we finally find out that it is the Jester behind all of that, then there's even more story to that. There's like 3 or 4 issues where the Jester is kind of doing stuff and Daredevil's trying to stop him. And he's teaming up with the guy who replaced Foggy Nelson, District Attorney Blake Tower. I knew I recognized that name somewhere, so I googled it, and it turns out that Blake Tower was in the Netflix series Season 2. Daredevil Season 2, Tower was the assistant to District Attorney Reyes. I did not know that that guy from Daredevil, the Netflix series, was a character in the comics. He's very different here. In the show, he's very slimy. He's not at all a good, nice character. He's behind some very shady stuff, trying to cover up a lot of shady stuff that his boss did, and he's just not a very likable character in that show. Here, he is the golden boy. He is a very nice, very likable guy. He meets Foggy Nelson for the span of like 4 panels, and then he has to go. He says, sorry, I gotta run. And Foggy's like, hey, I'm not mad at that guy at all. I kind of like him. I don't think that he's behind these commercials against me at all. And that's before we find out that Jester is actually behind those commercials. But I thought that was kind of cool that the Netflix series was actually pulling a character from Wolfman's Daredevil, who I want to say that that guy has shown up in other places, because when I was Googling the character, I think that I saw that he was part of a trial against the Punisher at one point in the comics. So it's possible that the people doing the Netflix show didn't even know that he originated in the Daredevil comics. I'm not even sure. But anyway, so there are a couple of dropped plot lines that Wolfman kind of sets up, and then he doesn't tie those stories up before he leaves. One of them, at one point, Foggy Nelson is thinking to himself, he's like, my fiance Debbie Harris, she's been missing for weeks, and I haven't told anybody about that. And I was thinking, why have you not told anybody about that? Why did you not report this to the police? Why did you not tell anyone at all? And I'm thinking that at this point, not telling somebody, not telling the police that somebody is missing, that seems like that's illegal. That seems like that would be obstructing an investigation, even though an investigation hasn't even started yet. That seems like that would be illegal. But Debbie Harris is a character who was introduced way back at the early 60s. I want to say Stan Lee might have introduced that character. If not Stan Lee, then Roy Thomas Thomas introduced her. But basically, she was a convicted felon who fell in love with Foggy. He fell in love with her, and she hasn't been a felon for a very, very long time. Admittedly, we haven't seen a lot of Debbie for a while because Matt went and lived in San Francisco, and while he was over there, we weren't getting a whole lot of Foggy. And then all the time that we have been getting with Foggy lately, we haven't seen Debbie. So we don't know how long she was actually missing, but she's missing. Somebody has kidnapped her. We find out who is responsible for kidnapping her, but the person who kidnapped her is working for somebody else, and we don't know who he was working for. I have a suspicion, but it leaves it on a huge cliffhanger by the end of this book. And so that is a big thing I want to go ahead and talk about. If you are reading these essential books and you want to know what happens next, well, join the club. I do too. There is, like I said, a 20 or so issue gap in between this book and the earliest Frank Miller stuff. I really wish that they did like an epic collection. Marvel has been doing these epic collections, which is kind of sort of a replacement for the essential stuff, where it's like if they started at the very beginning, they would have it all numbered out. So like you might see Epic Collection Daredevil issue 29 or something, or volume 29, and the way they've handled it is if they did all of these epics in order, started with Daredevil issue 1 and went all the way up to the present day, 29 might be the Typhoid Mary story from Ann Nocenti or something like that. So I really wish that they would do an epic collection that bridges that little tiny gap in between this and the earliest Frank Miller stuff. Just, if anything, I would really like to see the conclusion of that storyline of who kidnapped Debbie Harris. But other than that, there is one other subplot that Marv Wolfman introduced, and that is, in one issue, Daredevil is fighting the Deathstalker. And the Deathstalker was introduced, I think, in Volume 5, or maybe even Volume 4 of this run. At least Volume 5 or 4. And he is this ghost-like character. We don't really know anything about him. All we know is that anytime somebody tries to attack him, he becomes intangible. But then he is able to attack them. And we don't know if he's a mutant or if he's a ghoul. We don't really know anything about him. But at one point, Daredevil was fighting him. And meanwhile, you've got this alien who is trying to ascend back to his planet somewhere very, very far away, and he's like walking on these light discs, and then at one point he kind of sort of accidentally helps Daredevil fight off the Deathstalker, and then Daredevil's on the ground saying, I wonder who that guy walking on those light discs was. That was really weird. And the guy who we know is an alien, he's going out into space, and he says, if I ever come back again, it might mean your death, Daredevil. We never find out who that guy is. We don't know what he meant by it might mean your death if I have to come back. That was a really weird issue anyway, and as soon as that issue ended, I had a feeling that that was not going to be followed up on again, and sure enough, it was not. But overall, I thought this was a pretty good book. At one point, we get like almost a fifth of this book is devoted to Karen Page getting kidnapped, which was a really weird subplot because by this point, Karen Page was a main character in the Ghost Rider title, and so Daredevil is on his way over to California to try and find Karen Page, who it's been revealed on the news has been kidnapped, and then on his way, he teams up with with Iron Man to stop these alien creatures, and that doesn't really have anything to do with the kidnapping of Karen Page. It's just kind of a side quest while he's on to his main goal of finding his ex-girlfriend, and then he goes to California, and then the Deathstalker, who I mentioned earlier, he is dressed up in a different costume that Karen's father had dressed up in before he died, and he's like, hey, I need to know the secret of whatever your father was working on, because Karen's father was some kind of nuclear physicist or something like that, and he says, I need to know the secret of what he was working on, and Karen says, well, I'm not a scientist, I don't know anything about that. And then Daredevil and Ghost Rider team up, and then the Deathstalker, he runs away, and then he escapes. And then it's like, okay, well, see you later, Karen. I'm not really in love with you anymore. I'm in love with this other girl. They kind of have words a little bit. Karen is really unbearable, and I'm like, yay, I'm glad that she's not in the series anymore. So that was a really weird crossover. I guess they felt the need to kind of have Karen and Matt meet up with each other just so that Wolfman could say, look, Matt is completely 100% over Karen Page. There is no reason for her to come back and insert herself into Matt's life once again. Because that was something that kind of sort of happened at one point whenever he was getting with the Black Widow, where she was kind of sort of wanting to get with him, and they briefly got together for like one issue and then they broke up. At this point, I think Wolfman is just confirming that these two are completely over each other. They are not in love with each other anymore. They are not going to get back with each other again anytime in the very near future. So I guess I could kind of see the point of that, but it was still a really weird, kind of drawn out crossover event with Ghost Rider and then with, Iron Man. It was just a little bit of a blown, overdrawn crossover event there that I felt like could have been streamlined just a little bit. But overall, I really like this book. I want to say this is probably the best out of all of the essential books for Daredevil. That might be high praise, but when you look at all that's happened in the previous 5 volumes, you might realize, oh wait, those volumes weren't especially good. They had good moments, but overall, they weren't very great. So overall, I have to say this might be my favorite of the Essential Daredevil books. So those are my thoughts on Essential Daredevil Volume 6. The next Daredevil thing that I review, I think, is going to be the early Miller stuff. I'm not sure. There might be one other little quick volume in between now and then, but I'm going to be reviewing basically every Daredevil book chronologically that I can get my hands on. There might be one or two that I won't review, but for the most part, I'm going to be tackling every Daredevil book from here to the present day. It's been very slow going. It's been like a year and a half since I started reading Essential Daredevil Volume 1, but now I'm finally to the point where I can start reading the shorter volumes, and it won't take me nearly as long to read and review those. So look forward to a barrage of Daredevil reviews coming your way very soon in the near future. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.